All right, it's 3 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to General Psychology in this interesting semester. After today, we will be meeting on Tuesdays in McBrien Room 211, which is the largest building in the largest room in the building. The largest room in the building. Is it big enough for 40 people? No, but it's the best I can do for the moment. So there's that. Class will normally meet on Tuesdays. We will normally have Zoom only if there are some really weird happenings. So we'll see. Normally on Thursdays, class will be online for your Canvas assignments and whatever other work that needs to be done for you to catch up or read the modules and all that good stuff. There are videos on Canvas for you guys to watch that accompany this textbook. Not specifically this textbook, but most psychology textbooks are roughly similar. There's a wonderful series called Crash Course Psychology that has these really great videos done by Hank Green and his team. And there are also many, many other subjects that are covered by Crash Course. So you might want to look into that if you are taking other classes that have those Crash Course videos, because they're just really, really good. They're very well done and they are on YouTube. They're free. So that's another added bonus. Plus they are generally under 15 minutes long. So they're short, get to the point. They've got cute animations. It's a win-win. So I highly recommend those to you for any subject, not just psychology, but that will be part of your grade in the classes, watching those videos and having answering these short quizzes that I have in Canvas. That will be partly what I use to take attendance and such things to make sure that you're doing those things. If you read through the syllabus, there is a syllabus quiz also that you will need to complete. Before you start anything else, please do the syllabus quiz. So make sure that that is done. I want to make sure that you've read the syllabus. I have a cat hair stuck to my lip. Okay. There are a lot of pieces of information that are going to be useful for you in that syllabus. And I'm not going to waste the time here going through that because y'all are in college. I'm going to make the broad assumption that you can read. So there you go. As far as today, I just want to get through at least modules 1 through 3. Module 4 doesn't really have a whole heck of a lot in it that is really specific to psychology. It's specific to mathematics and statistics, but you can read that on your own very simply because there are only a few things in there that I really want you to know for this class. Plus, I'll be going over the normal curve when I go over intelligence testing. So that'll get covered anyway. So for module 1, the story of psychology. Well, first of all, you have to define what psychology is. The word itself is the study of the mind. Logos for anything that ends with logi is the study of, and psyche is the mind. But psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes according to this book. There are lots and lots of ways that you can define psychology, but that is a good, short, simple definition of psychology. But you also need to think in terms of, well, the study of the mind and mental processes, behavior and mental processes. The behavior part, well, behavior is everything that we do, everything you can see someone doing. And mental processes includes everything that we feel, everything that we think, everything that makes us us is part of that. So there's a lot of potential area of study in psychology. And one of the things that I hope that you will learn pretty early on in this class is that psychology is a lot more than therapy. Psychology is a lot more than mental illness. Psychology is a lot more than the kind of things that people think about when they think someone's a psychologist. The broad assumption is that they're a clinical or counseling psychologist who does therapy. That is a significant proportion of people who are in the field of psychology. However, there are also lots and lots and lots of other subfields in psychology that are, very popular and have lots and lots of people studying them. So I do want to just make sure that you're kind of aware of some of those things I'll talk about here shortly. Empiricism is a basic tenet of scientific study. It is the idea that knowledge comes from experience, the idea that science works through observation and experimentation. The first psychology lab back in 1879 with Wilhelm Wundt in Germany was the first time that psychology was really separate from other sciences. But it's been around for, well, that's 140 plus years. So psychology is hardly a new science. But as far as a lot of people's viewpoint, since we are studying something as complex and unpredictable as human beings and their behavior and their thought processes and their feelings, it is hard for us to have the same kind of empirical study in psychology as you would have in chemistry, where you're combining two types of substances, two elements, and they are going to have the same reaction every single time. That's not the case with people or animals, even for that matter. Not a whole lot of names that I want you to be aware of. Sigmund Freud, of course, is one of them. There's also a discussion in the book about Mary Calkins and Margaret Floyd Washburn as far as how important women have been in the history of psychology. So just, do take a look at that in the book. These are the majority of people who get bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctoral degrees in psychology are women. So it is a pretty female dominated field in a lot of areas, especially. So it is something just to make note of. Now, Sigmund Freud, of course, a lot of people really have a misunderstanding about Freud and think he's the main figure, the primary figure in psychology. He is the father of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. He is the father of personality study, which is extremely important. And the therapy part is very important. I actually am a licensed professional counselor, and I actually have a job doing therapy online. I work for an online entity part-time as well. So yeah, that's a very important thing. Freud was the first person to really have people kind of lay down on a couch and go, so tell me about your mother, and all of that kind of thing, which is very important, but he is not the father of psychology. A lot of people really have that. Wilhelm Wundt actually would be the father of psychology. He's the first one to have a dedicated space for psychological research, and that goes back to 1879. Freud also has a lot of very yeah, unusual ideas, had a bunch of unusual ideas about how people's psyches work. So we'll get into that later in the semester, but just know that, you know, he did have definitely major contributions to the field, but he is certainly not the father of psychological science. There are a few schools of thought. The book covers quite a few more than I care to go into talking about. I mean, read through it, you know, take a look at it, of course. But behaviorism is definitely one I want to discuss because we will talk about it several times through this class. Behaviorism is the view that psychology should focus on observable behavior only and have no regard for internal mental processes. There are very few strict behaviorists today. However, the basic principles of operant conditioning and classical conditioning and reinforcement and punishment are extremely powerful forces to change people's behavior and to change animal behavior also. So there are a lot of things that behaviorism started in the mid 20th century that really have lasting impact on classroom management strategies. If you ever had a class where you got some kind of a reward for doing your homework on time or for not talking in class or misbehaving in some other way, and you got some kind of tangible reward for that, well, that goes back to behaviorism. It goes back to operant conditioning. There are a lot of ways in which these principles are used all over the place. And people aren't necessarily thinking in terms of how it goes back to psychological science, but it does. I raised my kids using a lot of behaviorism, using a lot of positive reinforcement for appropriate behavior. I used a little bit of punishment, but you know, consequences are not necessarily punishment. When there's logical consequences for behavior, that is a consequence. It's not necessarily a punishment. You bring it on yourself. So there's a lot that is involved with that as well. However, am I a strict behaviorist? Absolutely not, not at all. But there are certainly situations when you have, you know, children that you're dealing with, or misbehaving roommates that you're dealing with. I've had students that have done projects in like applied psychology that, you know, they've gotten their roommates to start washing the dishes more often, stuff like that even. It's great for training animals to engage in appropriate behaviors and not engage in inappropriate behaviors. Like if you have a dog that's got destructive behaviors or barks too much or craps on the floor, whatever, there are a lot of ways that behaviorism can help you change that through positive reinforcement, through giving rewards for appropriate behavior. So that's a very powerful thing. Now, humanistic psychology kind of goes the opposite direction of the behaviorist, in that humanistic psychologists focus mainly on human growth and potential and on more kind of positive psychology. Positive psychology is another school of thought that came about in the 90s with Martin Seligman and other people who wanted to study what's right with people instead of what's wrong with people. And psychology often does just focus on the, you know, things that are wrong with us instead of the things that are right with us. So humanistic psychology was kind of the foundation of positive psychology coming around in the 90s. And humanistic psychology came about, roughly mid 20th century as well, partly as a response against behaviorism, because discounting all of the internal things that we have going on inside of us, as far as our thought processes, our feelings, you cannot look at a human being and really think that there's nothing that's changing or motivating their behavior other than what kind of reinforcement or punishment that they're getting for engaging in that behavior. We all have all kinds of motivations for engaging in potentially the same behaviors. So we're more complicated than that, basically, is what I'm saying. So a couple of things here that you've probably heard of from your high school biology class, or at least hopefully heard of from your high school biology class. Nature versus nurture simply is, genetics versus environment. What did you inherit from your parents as far as your genetic potentials, your genetic material? What kind of things are affecting your abilities or potentialities as far as what you were born with versus what kind of environment you have? Are you in a really privileged environment where there's a lot of resources available to you, or you're in a really impoverished environment where there are virtually no resources available to you? It's going to make a big difference. Now, the nature versus nurture isn't really a versus, it's an and, but it's still talked about like nature versus nurture. I don't think there are very many developmental psychologists that would think that one or the other is the reason that people have issues or the reason that people do really well. Now, is there evidence of either of these things having a lot of influence on us? Yeah, there is, absolutely. But the nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. So there's that. Natural selection, of course, is survival of the fittest from Charles Darwin. People talk jokingly, kind of jokingly, about Darwin Awards and people who take themselves out of the gene pool in some spectacularly dumb way. There are all sorts of things like that. But there is a certain amount of natural selection that does happen that is kind of hard to deny. There are things, I teach abnormal psychology as well, and I was just talking yesterday about how we have survived as a species to have anxieties because those of us who had ancestors that ran away from dangerous situations were more likely to have more children, more likely to survive to have more children. So, there is a tendency over, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for people to, have more anxiety issues instead of less anxiety issues, just because it is irritatingly advantageous for us to be afraid of stuff, which sucks, but it's also, the reality of it. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's also part of the whole natural selection idea that isn't necessarily the most beneficial for our optimal functioning, but it's most beneficial for our optimal survival. So we'll talk about some of that stuff throughout the semester as well. Psychiatrist versus psychologist. Again, not trying to make this a competition. I want you to know the difference between the two. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who went to medical school, learned how to be a doctor that could diagnose illnesses, do surgeries, deliver babies, set broken bones, et cetera, et cetera. And after they complete their 4 years of medical school, after their 4 years of undergraduate study, they go to internship and residency programs where they become psychiatrists. So it's mostly on the job training. They go have a residency program in a mental institution where they would learn, firsthand from, working with people who have persistent severe mental illnesses, things of that nature. Whereas a psychologist is someone who has a PhD or a PsyD, which is PSYD, a doctorate in psychology, where they have spent most likely their 4 years of undergraduate study getting a degree in psychology and then pursuing some aspect of psychology in graduate school, whether it is clinical or counseling psychology or developmental psychology or social psychology or experimental psychology or organizational or forensic or health or sports or blah, there's the school or industrial organizational. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of subfields in psychology that people can pursue. The time it takes to get a doctorate also is going to vary depending on what area you go into. There are doctoral programs in clinical psych that take anywhere from 4 to 7 years to complete, with 5 to 6 being the most common. There are other subfields that you can get a doctorate in 4 years pretty typically. So it depends on what you go into. Clinical and counseling are particularly long programs for people to get done with. That's part of what I don't have a doctorate. My husband does. I do not. I didn't get my doctorate until I was my master's degree until I was 40 years old. And at that point, I was like, I think I'm okay. That was a lot of work. My master's degree is a 60-hour master's degree. You can get doctorate degrees that are not that much more. My husband's, for example, he has a PhD from Tulane University in experimental social psychology, and his doctorate was 72 hours of study. So that's only 4 more classes than I had to get for my master's degree. So is that fair? No, it's not fair. It's not fair at all. If I only had to do 12 more hours to get my doctorate in counseling, I would, of course, hell yeah, I'd be all over that. It would take me 60 more hours for me to get my doctorate in counseling psych. So yeah, that's like 3 more years of me busting butt and at least $50,000. And so I can be Dr. Langley too. Yeah, I don't care. It's just not that important to me at this point in my life, especially. I mean, I'm in my 50s, good grief, who cares? But there are a lot of different subfields, and within our department alone here at Henderson. Okay, so I've got the counseling licensure, and I also work, as a therapist with my 60-hour master's degree. We've got my husband, who's experimental social psychology, and actually he's the authority on fiction and how you can teach psychology through fiction. Actually, he was just a keynote speaker for the American Psychological Association conference last week. So he's got a book called Batman in Psychology that's going into its 2nd edition he's working on right now, and a dozen other books aside from that. So he's kind of a pop culture and psychology person, although that's not what his main study was, but whatever, it's been a pretty cool thing for him. For let's see, other people, Dr. Williamson, it has a lot of background in the psychology of religion, although his doctorate, I believe, is in social psychology. Dr. Amids is in neuroscience. Dr. Wittig is developmental psychologist, even though she teaches statistics and research methods. Dr. Bejarano is, his main thing is behaviorism, animal behavior. So we've got a wide variety, even in our relatively small department, on that. So just kind of be aware that just because someone has a background in psychology doesn't mean they're therapists. And even those of us who are, believe me, I don't talk to someone at a party for the first time and start analyzing them and trying to figure out what diagnosis would suit them. I get paid good money to do that. I don't do it for fun. I'm not going to sit around and spend all my mental energy going, I think they might have indications of a mental disorder. No, hell no, I'm just talking to people. So do know that too. Yeah, and if you do, if we do ever get to the point where we can just talk and hang out like normal people again, yeah, I don't do that kind of stuff unless there's a real good pressing reason for me to. I mean, if you come into my office and start dumping all of your life problems on my desk and go, I need some help. Okay, yeah, then I'm going to start. I'll go, put my little counseling hat on and do that stuff. But otherwise, not so much. All right, module 2 is on thinking critically. Oh boy, is there a time that we need critical thinking skills more than we need now? I don't think there has been, really, because the internet has opened so many avenues for people to get information, both good and bad. critical thinking skills are really, really important as far as just being critical of claims, looking for agendas, looking for assumptions, looking for bias, looking for reasons why people are saying the things that they're saying. And critical thinking skills help us figure out whether information is worth listening to or not, or if it's just noise in the background. So critical thinking skills are really, really important because there's so much information available because of the ubiquitousness of the internet. Everyone has it in their pockets. I mean, we all have the smartphones. Pretty much everyone has a smartphone. You can be broke ass and still afford some kind of smartphone, even if it's a, pay by the month thing. You can still afford to have a pretty nice phone, most people. So you have access to this dramatic amount of information, but there's also a lot of it out there that is utter garbage. It's just other people's opinions, and they don't have any good basis for that opinion other than it's their opinion. And it makes them feel good to spout that opinion to other people. It is disheartening to me how many people will listen to some rando person on Facebook instead of listening to people who've spent their entire lives studying a subject. And we're seeing lots of that right now. Of course we are. This COVID thing has brought out a lot of, the last 5-6 years have really brought out a lot of divisiveness in people. And a lot of that does come from the internet, social media sites. They have algorithms that feed you more of the things that you want to hear. That's fact. So it's really important for us to kind of be able to recognize, well, the BS, be able to just have that ability to see through it and see it for what it is. And just, not be willing to, see things out there, not turn off the internet and, oh, I'm not going to get on any social media. I'm not saying that at all, but to just be aware of the intrinsic biases that it's feeding by those algorithms and things of that nature. So there are a few things that go on within critical thinking issues that can cause problems. For hindsight bias, hindsight bias is the I knew it all along phenomenon. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen because it makes us feel safe, it makes us feel comfortable, and it doesn't work that way necessarily. And everybody wants to be able to predict the future because it makes us feel powerful. It makes us feel smart. It makes us feel more comfortable and safe. So we do have a tendency to look back at something and go, yeah, I knew that was going to happen, or I knew that was the bad guy in that movie. Did you? Or are you just telling yourself that so you don't feel like, oh my gosh, I was so surprised at that? I mean, this is a really old movie now, but The Sixth Sense, M. Night Shyamalan did a movie with Bruce Willis way back when, and there were people who just swore they knew that, the surprise in that movie, and very few people actually did. I am convinced that was why the movie was so incredibly, popular, was because it actually had a legitimately huge plot twist in the film. And I'm not going to spoil it for that handful of you may not have ever watched it, but it had a huge plot twist. So things like that also interfere with us being able to think critically because we have these biases that we want to think that we knew what was going to happen, even though we didn't. Occam's razor is another one. This is a fancy way of saying what is most likely is probably the truth. So what is the most likely reason that I would have a bunch of dirt in the water bowls that I leave for my cats outside? Are the plants pulling themselves out of their pots that I have on my patio and washing themselves every night? Or is it more likely that I have raccoons around? I have seen raccoons here many, many times. The little buggers have gotten in my house a few times over the years. We actually had an entire family of baby raccoons that got in my house before. I live in an old house. We didn't know there was a hole in a cabinet in the kitchen when we first bought this house. And we not only got some possums in the house, we got some raccoons in the house too. So I know there are raccoons all over the place. I live a block, just a scant block from campus. And y'all, there are raccoons all over the place around here. There are possums all over the place around here. We're not very far from a lot of wooded area. So the most likely thing is, yeah, there's probably raccoons washing their little raccoon hands in my cat's water bowl. Okay. There are all kinds of improbable things that people will think of that might be true. It's possible there could be some other reason that, something could happen, but the most likely thing is usually going to be the reason for something to happen. So that's Occam's razor. Belief perseverance. This goes back to some of the biases that we have. This is believing what fits what you already believe. That is disregarding the rest. So this is one of the things that those predictive algorithms on different social media sites and news sites can really, really cause problems, because if you are only exposed to information that confirms your biases, you're just going to get more and more and more and more entrenched in your beliefs, even when they're wrong, even when they're not factual, even when they go against the betterment of lots of other people or, other groups, things like that. So belief perseverance is one of those things. We all have a tendency to want to seek out information that doesn't mess with our worldview. And that's totally understandable. But it's also something that you need to be aware of. I am old, y'all. I am way past middle age at this point. I'm only middle aged if I live well past 100 years old. I mean, I'm in my 50s. And the ways in which the news has changed in my adult life is astonishing and appalling, because you cannot trust news sources to tell you the truth on either end of the political spectrum or any other kind of divide. I remember as a child being able to watch the news and you could change the channels, all 5 of them. Yeah, I'm old. And it was the same news stories on every station, because they all were reporting the same stuff the same way, because there used to be laws about having to basically tell the truth with the news. And those went away in the 80s when Reagan was in office. And ever since then, it has been a free-for-all Wild West. I actually get most of my news from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. What the hell? Because they don't have an agenda. They don't have a political agenda they're pushing. They don't have a social agenda they're pushing. It's just the news. They're over on the other side of the freaking planet. They're invested in what happens here as much as any other country in the world, but it's not personal in the way that the news outlets here have it be personal. So that's where I get a lot of my news from. For a long, long time, I was watching like the Daily Show and stuff, because they made fun of everybody, and I was okay with that. So you do need to just be aware of where are you getting your information from, what kind of potential agenda bias do they have, what kind of bias is feeding into your bias. Is it making you feel better or feel worse? If you watch the news or you read something from a story and from a news site, and just over and over and over again, you find yourself angry or scared, that's probably not a very good news site for you, just mental health wise. There's an awful lot of stuff, clickbait, out there, and you know why? It's to make money, and they want to keep you freaked out and mad because it'll keep you coming back. And that is a really unhealthy business model for humanity. And yet here we are, and also just, and I'll get into this later in the class too, but when you are really emotional, when you are feeling scared or angry, I hate to say it is rudely, but the dumbest part of you is in charge. Your limbic system is in charge at that point, and you're not able to make good decisions when you're upset and when you're angry. Um, so just be aware of those kinds of things. If you can find a, more neutral place to be able to, get your information, that's going to probably be better for you just in general and for those around you also. So there's that. Just throw that out there because critical thinking is a skill that everybody needs. Doesn't matter what your major is, doesn't matter what you're going to do in life. Critical thinking skills are good things for you to have available to you. All right. Module 3, research strategies, how psychologists ask and answer questions. Okay, so number 1, it's not psychologists only, it's how everybody who does research, period, uses the experimental method. You've got 5 basic steps. I am not going to go into huge detail here because the Crash Course Psychology video number 2 that I've got linked in Canvas does a fantastic job, and Hank Green does a way better job articulating it than I could ever dream to do because he has a whole team of people with cool illustrations to be able to do that. So, but the main thing is you've got a question that you want answers to, and you make a hypothesis, which is a testable question. You come up with a theory, you come up with a hypothesis, all of these parts of the experimental method. So you want to have a hypothesis, which is just be able to make predictions about what you think is going to happen or not happen, however the course may be. And then you do an experiment. An experiment has to be repeatable. You're testing your hypothesis. You're testing the question that could be answered. And there are a lot of different ways in which you can do that. And I'll go into a little more detail on this, but the independent and dependent variable are the parameters of your study. Again, the Crash Course video does a far better job than I can explain, but the independent variable is the thing that's being manipulated, the thing that is changing, and the dependent variable depends on that independent variable. So if you are doing a study, I use a drug study because it's a very easy, at least I hope it's an easy to understand example. So if you have a situation where you're doing a drug study and you're trying to determine whether or not a pain medication for arthritis that's being marketed or wanting to be marketed by a drug company, and they want to do an experiment to see if it's any good. So the independent variable would be the drug, and the dependent variable will be if it works or not. So obviously that depends on the drug. You can have multiple independent variables in a study. Like for a drug, you can have different dosages of that drug. So that's something that would be part of it. The operational definition is the parameters of the study. How am I going to do this study? What am I going to do and how am I going to do it? Replication means repeatable. That's all that means. It's just a fancy way of saying I can do the study over and over and over again. And that's a really important part of any kind of experimental study. You need to be able to repeat it over and over again, probably many times over, to get, to make sure that any results you get are not a fluke, that they're not by accident. Experimental group and control group, you have, especially with a drug or some type of experiment like that, you're going to have a group of people who are getting the medication, and then you're going to have a group of people who are not getting that medication to compare whether or not it does actually make any difference in the experience of pain. So that's a really important part of any kind of experimental study. If there's not a control group, it's probably not that great of an experiment. Now, occasionally you will get a study like a drug study where they are seeing such huge benefit from a medication that would be unethical for them to not include the control group in it in a situation like that. But generally speaking, you need to have a control group as well. A double-blind procedure is when neither the experimenter or the subjects know which group they're in, whether they're in the experimental or the control group. Let me just kind of give you an example of a situation. Say we've got our drug study. A double-blind procedure means the person that is administering the drug doesn't know whether this is the active ingredient having drug or a sugar pill. That's all that means. So they can't affect the outcome of the study by saying something or doing something that could impact a person, especially when you're talking about psychological study, because the placebo effect is a powerful thing. Placebo effect is expectation or results based on expectations alone. That's what the placebo effect is. So it's an example. So if you are in the hospital and you just had your appendix out, ouch, you had surgery. It's not fun. Even if you have it laparoscopically, where they only have to do a couple of little incisions, there's still been a doctor digging around in your guts, and you're going to have discomfort afterwards for at least a few days. If the nurse comes in and tells you, oh, I am so sorry your doctor prescribed this for you. This medicine just does not do that much. It's just not that good. I don't know why she keeps prescribing this to people. How much pain relief do you think you're going to get from that after you have a nurse who works in the hospital telling you, oh, this stuff sucks? Versus if you had a nurse who came in with the little shot to put in your IV and went, oh, honey, you're about to have a really fun 4 hours. Which one do you think would do you more good pain-wise? Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that we try to control for with the placebo effect. We do not want results based on expectation alone. So the double-blind procedure helps negate those kinds of issues. And confounding variables are anything that could influence the outcome of a study that you don't have any control over. So if you're doing a drug study on an arthritis medication and one of the rounds of experiments that you do are on a nice sunny week, during a nice sunny week like we've had this week, in the last week, where it's been nice warm weather, very little rain, all that. And then another time that you do the experiment, it's cold, it's wet, it's raining, storming. Well, if you're talking about for an arthritis drug, the cold weather is going to have more pain for people. I have arthritis. I broke my leg really badly when I was 29, and I've had arthritis in it for a good decade now. I have hardware in my leg, and I can tell when the weather's changing. You know, it's that kind of thing. And of course, those kinds of things are confounding variables because we can't control the weather. You can't necessarily plan for those kinds of things. So those are the type of confounding variables that you can have. And you may have to adjust your data accordingly. You may have to throw out a whole set of data because of extremes in the weather or something like that. So you have to make allowances for that kind of thing. So that's part of, doing an experiment as well. So you get done with all of that work, and it is a lot of work. Then you have data. You've got numbers to crunch, you've got things to check on and statistics to run, and you analyze that data. Once you've analyzed that data, you come to a conclusion. Yes, this drug worked. No, it didn't, or this drug worked, but only at this dosage level, not that dosage level, yada, yada. You may want to retest, run the experiment again to get another set of data just to make sure that your results were due to the experimental variables or not. So that's also always an option, is to run the experiment again. But again, it needs to be replicable. So those are all parts of this experimental method. Now, there are other types of studies. Of course, you're familiar with surveys because y'all are on the internet. There's surveys everywhere. They pop up all over the place. This is another thing where critical thinking really does need to come in. Where did this information come from? What survey? What poll? Who was being polled? Who was being surveyed? What website was it from? Because you're going to get some wildly different answers if you're asking about the buying behavior of people on goodhousekeeping.com versus the buying behavior of people on architecturaldigest.com, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a really hoity-toity magazine about really, really fancy houses where they regularly feature $75,000 light fixtures and stuff like that. So yeah, it's going to be pretty different if you're at Better Homes and Gardens where they're, advertising stuff they sell at Walmart versus Architectural Digest, where they wouldn't be caught dead going into a Walmart. What's a Walmart? Ugh. So, you got to control for stuff like that. Also, surveys, it really is important to know who, not just the type of people, but how old are they? Maybe some information about gender would be important to have as well, because the kinds of, different behaviors and thinking processes, well, they are somewhat different between male and female and those people in between. So those are the things that surveys can be really good at getting information, but you do still need to know where that information is coming from, because you're going to get some very different kinds of answers depending on what population you're surveying. Naturalistic observation is just observing an organism in its natural environment. Typically, when you say naturalistic observation, you're talking about animal studies, you're talking about nature studies, looking at animals in their native environment, like Jane Goodall and her chimpanzee studies and those types of things. But you can also do naturalistic observation of human beings. Well, not so much now, but well, I mean, you can still do some. Yeah, boy, there are definitely a lot of behaviors that we're seeing in people that do tell us a lot just by looking at someone. So there are a lot of things like that that can be part of naturalistic observation, but it is typically going to be more with animal studies than with human studies, although there is some human study that can be done in naturalistic observation. Case studies are when you have one individual organism that's being studied because of some rare disease or rare phenomenon in psychology. Oh, let me drink real quick. In psychology, more often it's going to be something really unusual, something very rare, like the cases where you have feral children, where kids have been, where they have grown up with very little human contact, things like that. In the textbook, I know there's the case of the young boy from Avignon, France, that basically had little to no human contact and couldn't speak and was unable to just function like a person. There have been cases like that over the years, but they're thankfully quite rare. So those are things that are case studies. Very rare, like psychological disorders could be case studies. There are definitely case studies that have been done for rare things like dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality. It's very, very, very rare. Popular culture wouldn't lead you to believe that, but it's extraordinarily rare to find a case of that is legitimate. So things like that, you would have a case study. But again, the population is just all members of a particular group. So it can be everyone in this class. It could be everybody at Henderson. It could be everybody in Arkadelphia, and you can just grow it from there. But whatever population that you're working with, it's impossible to get every single member of a population of significant size. Now, could I do a study with every single person in this class? Yeah, probably, and get everyone. Yeah, probably could. However, if I wanted to get every single freshman for this class coming in, that would be really difficult for me to do. So what would be more sensible is to get a random sample of that population. And what you're talking about with a random sample is that every single person in that population has an equal chance of being included in the study, but it's every 10th person, every 100th person, every whatever, but they have an equal chance of being included. Now, even with a random sample, you could still get a really screwy, not useful mix. You could have 1,000 people for a study, and you have a pool of 10,000 people to draw from, and still by the randomness of the universe, end up with an overwhelming number of people who are in one fairly narrow range of age or one gender or socioeconomic level or what have you. So there are still even ways of random samples not being random enough, and you might have to redo your population. You might have to pull a different random sample from that population. So a correlation, this is just really important just for life in general, but a correlation is just a statistical numerical measure of a relationship. But correlations are all around us, and they are thrown out there, again, going back to some critical thinking. Correlations are thrown out there as causative things. Two things that occur together. A correlation is simply two things that occur together. Correlation does not prove causation. Oh my goodness, correlation does not prove causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other. It might, but it's not necessarily the case. And there are all sorts of ways in which one thing can go up and something else can go down, or two things go up together, and they don't have a damn thing to do with each other. There are so many different examples of how correlation does not prove causation. My husband's first roommate in college was adopted. And shortly after he was adopted, his parents had been having fertility issues. And yes, we're talking about way back in the 70s. We're talking about here. Actually, would have been in the 60s actually when he was born. And after he was adopted, his parents got pregnant naturally. His mother got pregnant. And I have heard this throughout my adult life that, oh, well, if you're having trouble getting pregnant, then if you adopt a baby, you're probably going to get pregnant within a year. And that is total bull crap. Because if you have severe endometriosis, if you have polycystic ovary syndrome, if you have whatever problems that were causing you to not be able to get pregnant, those aren't going to magically go away because you went through and adopted a kid. However, are there people who the relief of not only having, it can't be good for your sex life for one, but it certainly can't be good for your mental health stress-wise if you were just constantly thinking about, oh, I wish I could get pregnant. Oh, I want to get pregnant. And the pressure that it's putting on your body and your mind and your partner's body and mind. So yeah, there are those cases where people get pregnant after they've adopted a kid, but that is certainly a correlation, not a causation. There are other things that people tend to look at. With increased education, you have a lessened likelihood of going to jail. Well, yeah, there are a lot of different reasons. It's not the education itself. It's all the things that go along with that education. It means that you're more likely to have money. It means that you're more likely to not live in places where crimes happen. It means that you're not likely to be desperate enough to be a participant in a crime, as far as the criminal, not the victim wise, of course. There are all sorts of people who have money who commit crimes, but they have money enough to get them off the hook. So again, correlation does not prove causation. Just make sure that you kind of remember that, because it's just an important thing, not just because it'll be, a question on a test potentially, but because it's just good information to have as a person going through life. Informed consent and debriefing. Informed consent is simply telling someone enough about a study to enable them to decide if they want to participate in that study. So if you're doing a study that would involve, say, exposing someone to some kind of violent imagery, they'd have the choice to opt out of that with no penalty. If there's something with strong sexual imagery or religious imagery or something that, they do not care to, observe, they have the right to opt out of that program. When my husband was in graduate school, one of the things that he was doing for his thesis and dissertation was a study where he had people take caffeine in relatively large doses. And there are people whose lifestyle and or religion prohibits them using caffeinated products. So there are people who would opt out because of that. But informed consent just means that you know enough about the study. It doesn't mean you know everything about the study. There's a certain amount of deception. Yeah, they call it deception. It's lying. There's a certain amount of lying that we have to do to people in order for the study to be, valid, for it to be testing what we want it to test. But we have the obligation to tell people enough about a study to know whether or not they feel, it's okay to be in it. There have been some psychological studies that have been extraordinarily unethical, which we'll talk about, but informed consent was not really a thing then. So there's that. Debriefing at the end of a study is basically just telling the participants or the subjects in the study what it was about, what the point was, what were the results. That's all debriefing is. It's just telling them what we did and here's what we found out, and giving them the opportunity to have all of that information, like to send them all of the data, to send them the write-up in the journal article, to have them, linked in on that if they so choose. Now, most people are not going to choose to want all of that stuff, but they at least know, what happened and why. So there is part of the debriefing. Ethics and psychology, of course, we have any kind of research that's done with humans or animals, any living things. We have to go through a rigorous research approval for those things. You've got an internal review board at most entities that are going to look at what you're going to do and approve or not approve it, to make sure that there's as little harm done as is possible to the subjects of that study, be it animal or human subjects. And there are a lot of guidelines that go into deciding what is okay and what isn't okay. And a lot of that will have to do with the informed consent. If people can opt out of something, even that it might be a bit controversial, if they have the opportunity to opt out and not be penalized in any way, then you can still do some things that are somewhat controversial. The idea is just to do no lasting harm to people. You can temporarily be doing things that might be uncomfortable for your subjects, but not something that will cause them lasting harm or any kind of lasting psychological damage, certainly. So there's that. Now, the APA and ACA ethical guidelines, this has to do with the clinical side of things for therapists, for psychologists and counselors and social workers and such. The APA is the American Psychological Association. The ACA is the American Counseling Association, which I'm a member. I had to sign off on all of that stuff for me to get licensed in the first place. I had to take the national counseling exam and pass it high enough to be able to get licensed. And we have ethical guidelines that we're expected to follow when we are working with clients. And one of the main things that people get busted and lose their licenses over is not keeping it in their pants, which is amazing to me. But I'm also an old fart that's been married for 36 years. So, and yes, I got married when I was 10. There are a lot of people who lose their license, who lose their jobs, who lose all of that time and work and effort because they couldn't keep it in their pants, because they couldn't keep their tongue out of a client's mouth. You have to have professional boundaries, and you have to break you have to plow through with a truck so many boundaries for you to end up having sex with one of your clients. It's kind of hard for me to imagine how someone would do that, but I didn't get my license until I was a middle-aged married lady. So yeah, I don't know. Also things like going into business relationships with clients, using drugs with your client. I mean, there are places in the country now, and there's probably going to be more over the next few years, where you can smoke weed wherever for recreational purposes. So you could legitimately go outside and smoke a joint with a client after you get done with a session, and it'd be kosher. That's not the case now. And well, I guess if you both have medical marijuana, then maybe you could, but in most cases, that's just not going to be something that is kosher. I have heard of people who were working with people with drug problems and they would end a session by doing some meth together. Yeah, no, good God, no. So obviously there are those kinds of guidelines for a reason. And they're pretty straightforward. They're honestly pretty simple. It's amazing how many people manage to screw it up, but it does happen. And we've already gone an hour, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But read module 4. This is stuff that is pretty straightforward. I will be going over the standard deviation and normal curve later, but do just make sure mode, mean, median, and range are things that you should know from honest to goodness elementary school math. The mode is the most frequently occurring score in a distribution. The mean is the average, the median is the middle score, and the range is the top to the bottom score. So that's all those are. So those are pretty straightforward. But just do read that module. And for next week, we'll start with module 5. Again, check Canvas for your assignments. I do have a tentative schedule for the semester in the syllabus. So if you scroll down, when you look at that, and of course you will need to take that syllabus quiz. So make sure that you get that done and have a good rest of your week. And I'll actually see you in person next Tuesday in McBrien 211, room 211 on the 2nd floor. So I will see you then. Y'all have a good rest of your day.
I have a question real quick.
Yes.
Crap, I just forgot it. Sorry.
I have a question though. Are we going to meet again on Zoom on Thursday?
No, we will not meet on Thursdays typically, unless there's some weird thing that happens. We're going to be in person on Tuesday, and Thursday will be online. That's the partial online of the partial online class, basically. 'cause
Okay,
I've got
so we're not meeting again this week?
No.
Okay.
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 All righty. We'll see you on Tuesday next week. Anybody else? Okay, everybody else good? All right.